Hi, everyone. Glad to see a full room here. Good morning. I'm Ryan Heath. I write the AI newsletter and am the global tech correspondent at Axios. And Vishal Sharma here is the head of artificial general intelligence at Amazon. So a very small job that you've got there, Vishal. Welcome.
Thank you.
Now, over the course of the next hour, we're going to dig into what are the paths to this famous or infamous artificial general intelligence, both within Amazon and more broadly. But I think we need to try and get on the same page because America is not on the same page when it comes to AI at the moment. So we're going to walk through some of the tension points in the debate, what we can do to deal with the trust gaps and the fear that exists around some elements of AI, and even get into sort of advice for you if you have a small company or you're a founder and you want to figure out how to integrate AI into your work going forward. But Vishal, let's start with the easy one. It's the first AI track here at South by. So how is it for you? What's been the most exciting person or idea that you've come across?
Oh, I think there have been too many for me to pick one. Okay. I'm really happy to see this.
You're all winners.
What's that again?
They're all winners.
Oh yeah, absolutely. It's been like super satisfying to me. I've been involved in AI for a long time now, going on about 20 years since before deep learning existed. You know, I've worked on assistants and like other stuff, two of the world's biggest assistants, and it's just so gratifying to see this come to fruition, and just the profusion of ideas that we're seeing in AI now is pretty phenomenal. So it'd be hard to pick one.
Yeah, well, we've all been drowning in the hype around large language models, which are the kind of like leading edge of generative AI over the past year. But how does that feel for you? LLMs, they're just one part of AI. There are many types of AI. It might not be the way to get to artificial general intelligence. So when you look across everything you're doing at Amazon, where do these LLMs fit into that puzzle?
So the one thing I'll say about AI in general is there have been many, many ideas that have been tried. It's been a little bit evolutionary, is what I would say. And there's little doubt in my mind that what's happened with LLMs, with generative AI, has been fairly monumental, right? So we have to like recognize that. Other AI has produced many interesting results, but this one is special. And you know, there are some like obvious markers of this. So for example, Turing's test is an obvious one. You know, it was proposed way back in the 1950s. Stood for what, like 72 years?
Yep.
Now, experts will argue, but it's more or less fallen at this point in time, so that's pretty monumental. From an Amazon perspective, I'd say we think about AI at two levels, and what's going on with innovation in Amazon at kind of two levels. On the highest level, what I'd say is that there's a deep recognition that the chain of things that we started on in terms of technological development holds the keys to some pretty interesting gains for humanity. Like some of the deepest challenges, deepest opportunities that have existed for humanity are in the process of being unlocked by them. If you do this right, it could unlock basically an age of abundance for humanity. It's almost like the second coming of the Industrial Revolution. Now, what does that mean in terms of actual driven innovation in Amazon? There's sort of three components of it. So we often say we think about it in three layers, and there's innovation happening in all three of them. The base layer is hardware, and the chips, basically, the chips. And here, Amazon has, you know, these Trainium and Inferentia chipsets, and we can talk about those. The second layer is models, and Amazon's philosophy on models is choice, so multiplicity. And the highest layer is applications, and that's things like, you know, we did this Rufus assistant on shopping to help people's shopping journeys. I'm pretty excited about that. So that's how we're driving it.
Yeah. So I know you work across all those layers. You build chips, you have models, you help people fine-tune it all.
Yeah.
But let's dig into the models for a second. I think a lot of people come across sort of, they have the wrong impression that there are just like a few models out there because we've all heard so much about ChatGPT. But give us a sense of how many, you know, like dozens or hundreds of models go into what Amazon is building.
Oh, there's a lot of models, dozens, absolutely. So if you took something like Alexa, for example, it's a little bit of a misnomer to think there's this one model that's driving all of it. It isn't, actually. Under the covers, something Alexa would have like about 30 machine learning models that are inherent to it. Some of them are fairly small, right? So when you summon Alexa and you say, you know, Alexa, and you start to like talk to it, it's a very small model that's dedicated to detecting simply that wake word, and it's on the device, so nothing is getting streamed and it kind of gets woken up. Then there's models that have to do with presence, there are models to do with turning voice into text, and there's models around comprehension. So it's a multiplicity. And pretty much any big system that you look at will often contain a multiplicity of models.
Yep.
But that said, there is obviously, in terms of generative AI, the models have become bigger. And so far, I'd say the well on making them bigger is far from running dry. There's still a lot of development happening there. Now, there's more than one of those as well. Yep. So if you were to basically look at what we offer through our Bedrock program, which is an AWS offering where you can come get to models. We have Mistral in there, and Claude 3 just got announced with Claude 3's in there. There's models we're working on. So it's a big, I'd say it's a big family of things that's emerging here.
Yeah, and how big is this trend of the models becoming specialized? Because it seems to me, at one hand, okay, you've got some models that have trillions of data points that they have trained on now, but there are some basic things that they still don't do well. And they obviously don't have critical reasoning and they don't think for themselves yet. But even with trillions of data points, they still can't get some things done. So I see this trend towards smaller models that can run on our devices or on edge computing near our devices, and ones that are specialized in particular data sets so that they actually get that right. Like if you are a medical AI model, you should be trained on medical data, not on random crap from around the internet. How much of that is that going to be a trend across everyone's use of AI?
I think it already is a trend. Pretty much in any device that you're using, your smartphones or what have you, there's models that are running on the edge. That simply is the most efficient way to compute in many applications. So you're going to see that. It is also the case that you don't necessarily need to always apply the biggest model to basic problems, right? So let's say you're like a business owner. What you're trying to do is basic Q&A. You want to use your customer interactions as some sort of like a data set that you train off of. You don't necessarily need the biggest model. On the other hand, you're a writer. You want you want creativity. You want that turn of phrase. You want uniqueness. And then yes, like a bigger model will have more. I think inherent in your question though is this notion of, is this it? Is like generative AI it to some degree? And there, to some extent, the jury's out. It cannot, just to like be philosophical for a second. The big question there is, as these models become bigger, do they contain in them basically the world model, what's referred to as the world model, like a complete comprehension of the world? Now, it's certainly the case that with generative AI, these models have surprised us to some degree. Like they're doing things in terms of image generation, video generation, text comprehension, all those sorts of things that we would not expect. So that's certainly happening. But there's also a very compelling argument that says, no, they don't. Language has a certain level of abstraction in it, and you'll find some experts talking about this. It has a certain level of abstraction in it, which is not completely adequate to express sort of everything on the world. And there'll be situations, for example, if you have a robot and it's trying to maneuver around a space, for instance. There's many aspects to that space, potentially. Let's say it's a gardening robot, right? And it's like out in the garden, and it's doing stuff. Well, there's leaves on the trees that are moving. The grass is moving. Does it actually need a detailed comprehension of like all of those? And if it does have that, does that make it computationally prohibitive? So there's cost considerations that go into this. There is specific data training that goes into this. And this may go all the way down to the base layer, where today you have transformers, and there may be other alternatives. And there's certainly things like Mamba, and some of you might have heard like JPA, and other approaches in the industry that people are working on.
We could probably get a bit deeper into AGI later on in the conversation, but what sort of fundamental research do you do at Amazon? Do you actively look for these alternative ways of developing AI models, or is it all in now on transformer models and generative AI because that's what your customers are asking for, or you're a really customer-focused organization at Amazon, so everyone's saying they need an LLM and you've got to focus on the LLMs?
Yeah, it's a combination. I'd say we are extremely customer focused. So in the sense that, but that doesn't actually prevent us from doing a lot of research activities. And essentially, when we talk about customer focus, what that means is at all times, we're thinking about how this could make things better for a customer, what benefits could a customer derive from something. But when you back that out, it turns out that there's a lot of fundamental things you can do which hold the keys to potentially creating revolutionary results or very good results for customers. So it's a combination of things, is what I'd say. Not all our bets are on generative AI. I already described like many models which we use today, which are not generative in nature. If you went to our warehouses, for example, we have robots that obviously have models too that are working side by side with human associates. They're doing things like, finding products, picking up products, visually inspecting them for defects, plotting like optimal pick paths and things of that nature, which aren't necessarily generative in nature either. So it's a combination of things. It's not all in on transformers, in other words.
Good to hear, because there really is a big world out there, and I think we overthink the transformers a little bit. But as we're talking about these practical examples, let's talk about that third layer of what Amazon does, the application layer. In other words, the stuff you and I are going to interact with most of the time when we're dealing with AI. What are some of those practical examples where you, over years really, like 2 decades, you've been building this AI into what Amazon does? Like, how are we experiencing that as Amazon customers that we might not be realizing?
Oh, you're experiencing it all over the place. And frankly, generative AI is everywhere at this point, is what I would say. There's scarcely a significant part of the company that's untouched by it. So I could just give you so many examples. So if you're like an advertiser that wants to advertise on Amazon, well, last year at the Unbox conference, that's our advertising conference, we announced that you can do image generation with it, lifestyle images that you can do. And the folks that have been involved in the advertising industry know that creative is often the most expensive part of doing advertising. And well, now you've got some automation to help with that. That's generative. If you are a seller that's trying to sell on Amazon, then your product listings can be enabled with generative AI as well, to make them more compelling, more accurate. So that works with it. If you're a coder, right? So we have Code Whisperer, pretty extraordinary results with it, right? It's going to recommend code to you, code blocks to you. On average, I think we clock something like 57% improvement in efficiency in output, which is like a really big deal. There was an example recently where we had 5 Amazon developers do a Java upgrade for us. I forget which versions it was. And they did like 1,000 applications in like 2 days, which is just staggering if you think about what that is. And then we have Rufus, which is a shopping journeys. In Alexa, we had this preview called Let's Chat, which just makes Alexa much more conversational and fluid. And so it's I could just recount so many of them for you. And they're all ending up and showing up for customers.
And what does that, within your teams or your experience across the company, what sort of impact does that have on the jobs of people at Amazon? So like they can get more done, but does that mean people are just producing more? Do they get to not work 12 hours a day? It doesn't seem like anyone's getting fired because you literally employ millions of people. But how do all those pieces reconfigure as more and more AI becomes part of the daily work?
So this is like it's kind of like a meme, I'd say, in the world. And, it's a new technology. It's very powerful. It has all these productivity benefits. So does like everybody lose their jobs? How does this turn out? And the answer is no. That's not been our experience. It's almost like a sense that happens with every new technology that emerges, often because you haven't quite figured out what it's going to unlock for the economy yet. And so, but in our experience, each one of those things just results in more growth, right? So an example of that would be, we have something just north of 750,000 robots in Amazon warehouses. What does that mean? It means that the warehouses become more efficient. They become safer. Things happen a lot faster. But at the same time, we take those gains and kind of plow them back to offer more things to customers. And the consequence has been that the workforce has doubled in size, I think over the last few years, to like 1.5 million at this point in time. So that's our expectation. There's always more things to do. There's always more compelling. There's not like a ceiling on the amount of economic value or value that can be created in the world. And so if you take that as a guiding principle, it's just more stuff getting unlocked.
What I was sort of touching on there was the sort of trust and the fear aspects of AI. and they're not specific to Amazon, so I don't mean to make it about you as a company, but I spent a lot of time reporting on those trust gaps, and what really comes out across all of the data, and it can be true of America, it's certainly true of the Western democratic countries as a whole, is that they fear AI and to some extent use it less or use it in more limited ways than people in some other countries, particularly in Asia. And people here are more skeptical both of the big tech companies and of the regulators in the role that they might play in AI. And the most shocking figure I saw of all was about 5 times as many Americans are scared of AI as they are excited by it. What does that feel like turning up to work every day? Like, your whole job is to give people more AI. Does that feel jarring? Do you see those numbers and think, oh, okay, how can we change the products to close those gaps? Like, how does it work in practice, your relationship with that information?
Look, I mean, I love science fiction, so there's scarcely like a dystopian AI future that I haven't, like, read about and enjoyed, to be completely honest. And there's so many like popular media kind of memes around this thing. Supercomputers just kind of raging out of control, to Terminator, to Skynet. There, I've said it, Skynet. So these things are out there. There's not a lot of foundation, I'd say, in reality. What I will say is that there needs to be a responsible approach to AI, because AI is unlocking a lot of capabilities, much like the internet did before, and much like other technologies have before. And so we have to approach it with that sense. And so there's principles which are emerging around this, and for those who are interested, a good place to go see this would be in our Titan Text LLM service card. It's a mouthful, but Titan Text is basically our family of models that we give to enterprises, LLM models. And so there's a service card, and it highlights some principles around responsibility. And it could be articulated in many different ways, but I just like to pull 3 out because they make sense to me, and I think they kind of resonate. The first one is...
This, by the way, is practically answering one of the audience questions from Louise Kendreva, who wants to know 3 ethical challenges around AI.
There you go, Louise.
So you're getting your answer.
Thank you for that question. So the first one is veracity. You want AI to be fundamentally not hallucinate, be grounded in truth, and be accurate. And that's a pretty broad definition that also includes things like hallucination, for example, which is not intentional. It's just a side effect of things that happen in models. The second is safety. And so here, we do things like extensive red teaming. You will have to test these models to see what happens and what they produce in different circumstances. And the third point, which is related to that, is controllability. And the notion there is, when you interact with an AI model with broadly similar things, with a broadly similar set of inputs under broadly similar circumstances, you would like output or outcomes to happen which are broadly similar to one another. It's predictable in some way, shape, or form. So those 3 concepts kind of drive, then like a ton of stuff comes out of there, transparency and explainability, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Now, thinking about grounding the AI in truth, one way to do that is something called retrieval augmented generation, RAG. Is that the best way to do it? What have you found is most useful for the AI to be able to prove, to cite its sources, and for you to be able to check its work, basically?
Yeah, so one quick point before we get into RAG. So RAG is very interesting and very valuable. One quick point to note there is just to acknowledge a debate that's been raging in the industry, I'd say, for a while. So there's a school of thought that says, and I'm deliberately creating like a polarized explanation of it, just to bring the point out, but there's a school of thought that says that you don't necessarily need to go ground. So the whole point around RAG is it's a structured set of truths, if you will, right? So RAG will say things like, Tallinn is the capital of Estonia, right? Did I get that right?
Yes.
I think I did. Tallinn is the capital of Estonia. So that's just a fact, and you don't want a model to hallucinate that under any circumstances. So you can have like a list of truths that you go refer to. It can be organized as a knowledge graph. It could be organized as a vector database. There are many different ways to like create that organization, and you're kind of guaranteed, quote unquote, guaranteed truth in that situation. A different school of thought says it's just a matter of time until the models become capable enough, where this truth will kind of get woven into the models themselves. So in other words, groundedness will emerge as a property of a model that's capable enough.
Okay. An open source model? Like, how's that going to happen in a closed model?
Yeah, so all those strains are, of discussion are occurring there. It hasn't happened yet. There's some papers around this that would argue that, no, you will always need some kind of structured groundedness to this. And some of those things kind of take you back down almost to the deepest, most fundamental levels of this, which is, can transformers actually produce this, or can other technologies produce this? Jury's out. Lots of work is getting done. Long story short on this, though, is you do need groundedness. So there are some techniques that enable it right now. Of the various techniques I've seen, I would say RAG is probably the one that works the best in my experience. And if there's others that people have run into, I want to hear about them.
Yes, please. Send them through in the questions, and we'll ask Vishal. And then thinking about the safety culture, like there's technical aspects to building safe models, but a lot of this is cultural. You need AI literacy. You need people to be taught sort of ethics at the beginning of the process. And then there's a big debate about open versus closed models. And hearing you talk about red teaming, one way I think of open source is, it can be really dangerous if you're just handing over your model to Kim Jong-un in North Korea. At another level, you can just be permanently red teaming and realigning the model if you're going open source. How are those debates sort of handled inside Amazon? What's your take on it?
That's a great question. That's a great question, actually. So just to take a step back and do like a cultural note about the company, one thing you do have to realize about Amazon is that the company has this notion of leadership principles. You can go read about them. They're widely available. You can go see them. And one leadership principle that we have, which kind of unifies the entire employee base, like everyone's heard them and internalized them, is that success and scale bring broad responsibility. And I sort of put this in the umbrella of that, which is, if you're going to create powerful technologies, then there's a responsibility that accompanies them. So in that, like the three things I talked about, veracity, safety, controllability are like an inherent component of it. Absolutely. And that applies to both closed and open models, is what I would say. Now, other folks might articulate it differently, but I think those principles are kind of stand. That's one aspect. The second is, we also have to recognize that just as with the internet, when the internet evolved and it came into being, it threw up new challenges, new opportunities that we then had to adapt to, right? So for example, I could give like so many examples and they'll be familiar.
Yeah, please. Right? People love concrete examples, so go for it.
One example I'd toss out is like cyberbullying on social media. That's like an example, right? So we don't know how, the opportunities that'll get unlocked or the challenges that AI will throw up. So we have to be adaptive to that. As more things are discovered about it, our framework on making sure that it's safe needs to evolve and keep step with that. That's going to be very important. A different aspect here is, so obviously Amazon has a lot of these practices. How do we take it to our partners? Because we work with a lot of companies out there, a lot of people out there. And they're educating folks through AWS is a very important component. So we have educational materials that we take out. And there's also a component of just baking it into the tools themselves, right? So I spoke about image generation earlier. So you obviously want to make sure that that doesn't do bad things.
And how does Amazon get everyone on the same page internally on those principles? Is this something that now gets baked into onboarding? Did you all have to do big stuff retreats, going like, all right, we're all in on generative AI, and here are the rules. Like, how do you make sure everyone abides by that rather than just trusting people are reading the fine print somewhere?
Yeah, it's I'd say leadership principles is the core component of it, and that's the thing that basically distributes this concept and makes sure that everybody shares it. They are repeated often, and it's not dissimilar from like other organizations which are large, where you establish a system of ethics and behavior and principles, and you follow it. And there is a saying that repetition does not spoil the prayer. In many of these situations, so there's an aspect of that. But like I said, you also have to be not formulaic, and we have to adapt to what happens with AI. Look, I mean, it's certainly the case that we are seeing some properties emerging in AI. So, the notion of, for example, induction heads, to get like a little bit technical, there are discoveries that are made along the way. There are scaling laws which are being observed as well. There's going to be other principles that emerge over time. Moore's law did not exist before semiconductors became big. Metcalfe's law did not exist before people began to really think about what a social network or networks could look like. It's probably the case that there'll be other laws that remain to be discovered, but that's going to unfold itself with time.
Let's bring in Richard Gutia's question on the screen here. Could you share examples when AI caught you by surprise?
Oh, Richard, there are like many examples of this, over my career. Way back in the day, I remember this is, I'm going back to like 1999 now, when one thing we were experimenting with, was taking some techniques.
And were you a PhD student at this point,
or
you were out in the workforce?
I've actually been on a leave of absence for 30 years for a PhD.
Okay.
One day.
Let's talk about that. What was this PhD on?
One day. Distributed systems.
Okay.
Yeah, distributed, which also I love. We can talk about that.
Okay, we'll get to that in the AGI section.
Yeah, so back in the day, we had like a catalog that we were working with, and I was trying to classify items in there. And we were taking some clustering techniques, which today would be considered very, very basic, and clustering with them, and it was just magical. To be able to give some examples, not have to define hard rules, and to have it go in and cluster these things, it was electrifying. It truly was electrifying to watch. It was almost like—
It was a positive surprise.
It was a positive surprise. It was like something was binning, these things. So that was pretty electrifying. There was another time when, which was many years later, and after deep learning had emerged, or was beginning to emerge, there was this time when I got exposed to this project where we were taking like images and we were trying to classify whether there's a cat in them or not. People in the tech industry love cats, as you know. All of you love cats. Is there anyone here who does not love cats? And so it's classifying. And you were looking, and I was looking at what's going on in the different layers.
Yep.
And at a certain layer, you saw the outline of the cat being extracted and kind of emerging, and when you inspected it. And the fact that this had not been programmed into the system to extract those kinds of things, and was kind of happening by itself, self-organizing to some degree, was pretty magical, I have to say. Yeah.
Well,
Very early examples.
That's actually a really good way to get into AGI and the self-organizing question, because obviously one of the principles of being human or a capable human is your autonomy and your ability to self-organize your life or your family and so on. So I don't know that that is like a definition of AGI, but when we think about, like I think Amazon defines AGI as a safe, controllable AI that instantly understands and anticipates and accomplishes a customer's needs and wants. And there are a few other definitions out there, but that to me describes a different type of AI to what we are talking about today. It's a leap ahead. And Sam Altman in November was saying we're going to need something more than LLMs. Jan LeCun at Meta basically thinks we just need to go back to the drawing board and come up with a different approach for AGI. And this morning I published a story about a startup called Versus AI that thinks you actually need a nature-based approach, that we need to reconstruct biological organisms, and create webs of small AGIs, basically, rather than ever aim at a single or a few super intelligent systems. So it gets a bit back to this distributed intelligence idea of your PhD. So I wanted to get your take on kind of what type of AGI Amazon is aiming at, and what do you think is the sort of framework of AGI when we get there? Are we going to have a web or a huge network of all these little specialist AGIs? Or are we headed towards something more like the tech markets we see today, where there's a few big dominant systems, or maybe even sovereign AGI, where you have like these national superintelligences?
Oh, some deep questions there, not
question.
difficult at all. And I do want to correct one quick thing. Yep. I never actually finished that PhD.
Okay.
So I wouldn't want to claim credit for that, or not yet anyways.
But tell us about that. What was your thinking in that PhD? Because it kind of was pointed at AGI, wasn't it?
It's relevant. So it's basically, without talking about that that exact thing, what I'd say is, there's this notion of like when you have multiple agents or nodes or machines, how do you get them to coordinate and collaborate with one another, right? And that could be required in many different situations, obviously. There's this notion in distributed systems of loosely coupled versus tightly coupled.
Yep.
So super tightly coupled would be they're all sharing the same memory, and they're able to operate from that. Loosely coupled would be just message passing, et cetera. And there's pros and cons to both of them. So what I'd say is the world as it exists today in terms of technology, as it's likely to evolve, is going to be a combination of those things. And you see some to and fro that happens in the tech industry on this. Obviously, the world started back in the day with mainframes and client server, which you had sort of these gigantic systems, and then with mainframes, you had gigantic systems and these terminals, not that smart, hanging off of that. Yep. Then you got disaggregated into client server a little bit.
Yep.
The web and the internet's emergence disaggregated them even more. Then you had cloud computing emerge because there's inherent economic efficiencies and just technical capabilities that are enabled by that. And so there's a to and fro. What I'd say is I think I see a heterogeneous world, personally, where these things coexist with one another. So I definitely do see the notion of smaller scale focused models, smaller scale focused AIs that are operating. They operate today to great effect and to great benefit. And then larger scale things. The G in AGI stands for generalized.
Yep.
So the inherent notion there is that these models are going to become more and more generalized, able to do more and more and more at human expertise level.
Yep.
And so that's what the AGI thing is. Now, the thing is, getting a precise definition of AGI is a hard thing. As you know, if you ask 10 experts on AGI, you'll get 10 different explanations from them. But I'd say the notion of generalization is something that stems from it.
Yep.
Now, just creating a big model could also potentially mean that it makes the smaller models better, because you can do things like distillation, and you can do things like taking something larger and then making more focused things from it. And yes, you could have a situation where you have more distribution. Now, the startup that you were mentioning, I'm not super aware of them, but what I'd say is the notion that a world in which everything could be distributed is an interesting one. I'd say the current axis of development has been around larger models.
Yep.
Now, we know that there is some efficiencies to be gained there. Perhaps they're like too large, and they don't always need to be that large. So it remains to be seen how that'll evolve.
Yeah, it seems to me that
you need a crystal ball to be able to completely.
Well, it seems to me like that the big models have advantages in particular tasks, but then there are other tasks, and this is the one that Jan LeCun mentions. He was a bit like, well, we have trillions of parameters in these models, and they can't instruct a robot to unload a dishwasher. But I can teach my 10-year-old kid in 30 seconds how to fill up or unload a dishwasher. Yeah. So what's the point of these trillions of parameters if they can't do these basic sort of human tasks?
Yeah.
And so his thinking there is you have to go back to basics and think how do babies learn, basically? How do we as biological organisms, all the cells in our body, how do they interact with each other? How do they talk to each other? And until you figure out how that happens and then have them all talking to each other, you won't in the end get to something that counts as like a super or general intelligence.
Yeah, superintelligence is not a term I would use. But generalized intelligence.
Because superintelligence implies like a single overlord, or is there some other negative?
It's just not a term of art today, is what I would say. So if AGI has 10 definitions, I think if you pose the term superintelligence, it's going to have like 1 million definitions. So it's just hard to, not everyone will have the same thing. So this is just more semantics than anything else. What I would say is that, yes, it is probably the case that, that there's more fundamental work that needs to be done in terms of AI, that the current technologies we have are not the end-all and be-all. So in that sense, I think that is accurate. Yes, it is true. It kind of harkens back to what I was saying earlier a little bit, though, which is, is it a fair assumption that the world model is contained within a large enough LLM?
Yeah.
And can it get inferred? So is it the case, for example, that you could, using enough language, describe the act of a cat walking down to the nth degree, where a large enough system would be able to comprehend it simply by learning enough about language?
Yep.
And the jury is out on that. There is not complete agreement on that, is what I would say. There are some pretty valid points made that the models that exist, the biggest models that exist today, aren't capable of doing certain things. Yep. That are certainly, or sometimes just not capable of doing them efficiently.
Yep.
And so that's a valid point. I think we will see groundbreaking research and developments coming out. That's probably true.
Now, time to build in a couple more of these audience questions. Julius Liebisch is asking, what are the greatest technical hurdles Amazon will have to overcome in the near future? So I will take that to mean related to the path to AGI, but throw in some others if you want to.
Relating to AI. So we've been working on AGI for a long time, and Alexa was an early example of that. It's in millions of homes. It's entered a part of the popular culture, if you will. There's songs about it, and you know, it's and
songs made with it.
Songs
very popular here.
Songs about it. So we've been working on this a long time. One thing I'll say is, for the pursuit of AGI and to get to AGI, it's very unlikely that there's going to be a moment in time when you suddenly decide, oh, AGI wasn't here yet, and AGI is here today. That's probably not going to happen. It's going to be a series of developments. And I think we are along that journey. We've probably been on that journey, I'd say, for 20 years. Now, it may not feel like it, but we have been. So we're using AI across the company in pretty much all aspects of it. Like I said, you know, it's part of shopping, it's part of the robotics, it's part of, you just take any example. And that's just going to continue to apply. The interesting thing will be to unlock possibilities that haven't existed before. So for example, you know, we have self-driving. This is the Zoox unit that engages in self-driving, and there's other units that are working on things of this nature. So I'd say the biggest technical hurdles in my mind are unlocking use cases which will be very valuable to people and to humanity, which have not been unlocked yet.
And what's on your dream list? What are the things where you sit there and you think, wow, if I could do this by the time I retire, you know, I've really made it?
I mean, like I said, inherent in the notion of, you know, the next industrial revolution, inherent in the notion of like unlocking an age of abundance, is the idea that the profusion of use cases that will become possible and benefits will be limitless almost, will feel limitless. So, you know, one notion, for example, that's kind of near and dear to my heart is the idea of applying AGI, you know, just to everybody and to every situation, especially situations which are challenging today. So I'll pick like an example. Imagine that you're a doctor in an underdeveloped area of the world, right? And medicines are in short supply, information is in short supply. You know, how do you, a patient walks in, like how do you interact with them? How do you diagnose them? How do you do treatment for them? And now imagine that you actually had a helper that was able to take your notes. It was able to take, you know, the patient's history maybe because this has been used for a little bit of time. It was able to take wellness and disease trends in the region. Maybe even able to take into account medicine availability in the region. And then come up with diagnoses and maybe a couple of like alternative treatment paths, right? Phenomenal difference in this person's life, right? And so that's such a magical kind of application. Imagine a student who's in school, let's say middle school, and they're struggling with some coursework, and you know they happen to be in like in a certain position with a certain level of comprehension about principles and topics and fundamentals, and now they need to get to this like other position. Well, you know the way I can sometimes think about it is what we have today are these, because of economic reasons, these cookie cutter bridges that exist. And somehow that bridge needs to fit you. And that's how you get to walk across. Whereas, you know, what AGI enables you to do is just inherently way more flexible. Take you into account, take you through your own self-paced way, what works for you, using principles that you understand and sort of walk you over that bridge to where you need to be. Pretty magical.
Go ahead. I'm going to ask you about that because I agree on the personalization point. That's where, you know, there's been a lot of talk recently, and sort of the debate is getting narrowed down a little bit to people talking about sort of AI being like an assistant with superpowers for you. And that sounds great, but then kind of the challenge I'd throw out there is that a lot of the time when I've tried to use different AI systems, you know, I worry that it's based on lowest common denominators and averages and cliches, basically, when all you're doing is fancy autocomplete. And so my question then is, you know, what is this going to mean for neurodivergent people? And I would classify myself as one of those people. And I don't want something that is trying to shove me into a box or doesn't work the way my brain works. So can we imagine a world where there is like an AGI for each of us? Like, is that reaching too far and dreaming too much, where instead of there being a few huge AGIs, we can actually have these extremely personalized AGIs that do act as like a genuine assistant with superpowers, where we don't have to be fit into other people's boxes and labels.
So first of all, thank you for sharing that personal note about yourself. I definitely appreciate that. And yes, I do think it's the case that it will be a capability with AGI to increasingly personalize the interactions with people. And to be honest, just to take a more trivial, I'd say, example, I'm not really the same person in the morning as I'm in the evening, right? In the morning, I'm trying to get to work. I may be like more focused. I don't want like an AI to be recommending ideas to me about maybe what to watch or what to do and so on. I want clip responses. I want specific interactions. I want it to help me do what I'm trying to do. In the evening, I might be in a different frame of mind. Might be more relaxed. Tell me what to cook. Give me recipe ideas, or maybe like entertainment options, or like something else. And you can imagine this applying in many different places, even with stuff that's much more significant, like neurodivergence. It definitely makes sense that AGI will be capable of far more personalization with you, and maintain personal context about you, which could be anything, right? It could be the music you prefer. It could be the things you like to eat. It could be the mood you're in. It could be your social interactions, just like all these dimensions. That's a different way of saying that, to some degree, it's going to essentially have a model of you, if you will, and then it'll be able to adapt to communicating with you in the style that works for you. So yeah, I think your hope is actually well-founded. Yeah.
And I guess to be fair as well, I think sometimes we tell ourselves lies. We think we're more unique than we are, or we think we're more divergent than we are, because that's a nice story to tell ourselves. And what I'm noticing from a lot of the algorithms on social media and now AI is like, well, actually, we're a bit more similar to each other than we realized, or we are a bit more repetitive than we think we are when we actually think we're these clever people who have all these different modes of living and ways of thinking, and actually the AI knows us better than we do sometimes.
Well, we should celebrate our similarities, and we should celebrate our differences. I think they both add like a ton of value to our lives. Absolutely. And yeah, it's not necessarily a bad thing to have reflected back at you. As long as it's done for your own personal benefit in a way that works for you, to have reflected back at you, it's like having a trustworthy friend, if you will. Is the direction it should move in. And it's quite instructive at other levels too, right? So for example, when you consume media, sometimes it's good to know how much media you're consuming and be made aware of that. I've done things like just tracking all the places I've been in the last month or so, and just getting that reflected back at me is valuable. So
But do you actually do anything different with those numbers? I just feel like I'm being lectured. I'm like, oh, another 9 hours on the phone today. I don't do anything to change.
Well, so this is slightly at a different topic. But what I'd say is the other aspect that we've been working on for a very long time with AI has been ambient computing. That's been a very big aspect of what we do. And so the idea has been, you don't really want people to live their entire lives with their heads bent over. You want them to hold their heads up and be able to talk out into the open. And what you see with Alexa really came from that, which is we want computing to be just woven into your life, not become the center of it. So you use it when you use it, and then it fades away into the background when you don't need it.
Well, that actually, like in a strange way, that now brings me to embodied AI, like uses of AI with robots, for example. And so Alexa is kind of like almost the opposite of that Jetsons idea, sort of in the 60s, that we were all going to have this sort of assistant that wheeled around in front of us and made us sandwiches and babysat the kids and whatever. And then the AI you're talking about sort of fades into the background. How do those sort of choices get made in Amazon? Because you do have this embodied AI or AI-powered robots in your warehouses, and then you've got this stuff that fades into the background. Is it just different for each use case? Like how do you sort of like handle those questions?
It's really focused on customer benefit. And so the idea there is, what will be good for customers to use and to have as a part of their lives. That's what we end up focusing on. And in fact, we do robotics even outside the warehouse. So for example, we have the Astro robot, which is, a robot that can like follow you around and does things and increase security.
I did not know that.
For,
like I can buy that as a robot from Amazon.
You could buy that as a robot from Amazon. And it's small and it kind of follows you around. So yeah, we are investigating these things and investing in them. Again, being customer obsessed. That's actually one of the leadership principles. Is customer obsession. Literally is what it's called. And so that's a component of that. I'm excited about embodied AI as well. And that's because it's also pushing the frontiers of AI in some interesting ways. You talked about some of the limitations of existing things that we're doing.
Yep.
And there's some interesting thinking that comes from when examining embodied applications, where you want to bring in visual input, you want to bring in audio input, make that all a component in, in sort of some sort of a multimodal approach to these things.
And are these independent AI tools, or are we talking things like prosthetic limbs that are powered with AI? What sort of things are we talking about?
Yeah, there's no reason why, there's not, again, the G in AGI would be generalized, and so there's no reason why all these applications will not exist and benefit from it. Yeah, I'd say all of the above.
Now we're getting down to our sort of last sort of quarter of the discussion now, and I asked you sort of some of the things that surprised you on AI and things that you dream of building. But what is the sort of killer app that would improve your own sort of work life or home life, like for AI? What's the thing that's most missing out of your life now?
First of all, I'd say that my home life is tremendously improved by AI, even today. In the sense that, and it's just a spectrum of things. So Alexa definitely improves my life. There are like specific things I could pull out from there, which are quite interesting. And actually, this goes back to the question that was asked earlier: when did AI surprise you? So, Alexa, for example, has this notion called hunches, which I don't know if you're familiar with, but it's this notion that if you're using Alexa to control your home, you're turning lights on and off with it, and perhaps let's say you're going to bed every night and you have a routine, right? You turn the TV off, you turn the lights off, you lock the back door. Maybe you hit your bed and then you turn on the white noise because it helps you drift off into sleep. And then one night you forget to lock the back door. And what happens frequently is that Alexa will notice that, and the AI will notice it and say, would you like me to lock the back door? And it's one of those things that increases security and safety in your life just inherently.
Unless you're putting the trash out while it does it, and then you're locked out.
Those things happen, absolutely.
I locked my husband out of the apartment once, so don't worry, it happens.
I bet you heard about that.
Definitely heard about that, yeah.
So yeah, I mean, so the notion here is that it's gonna basically benefit all these aspects of life, and you could think about things to do with safety and security. We get these mails and communication constantly about people that have been in difficult situations. That they've called. For example, there was this one case where this gentleman sort of fell through a staircase and was alone at home and was able to use Alexa to call for help, and someone came in and sort of rescued them. So ensuring safety, ensuring security, sort of like a baseline case is very important. And then all the way up to helping you be more creative. I guess I'm talking about the pyramid of needs almost, right? Helping you be more creative, more fulfilled in life is another aspect. So I think AGI is going to run that gamut. And to different degrees, it's already begun to enable all of it. But this is my point around it's a process. It's not a specific point in time.
And because there is a big debate about, and one of the things that, sorry, I'll take that back. One of the things that has surprised me as companies have attempted to integrate AI into their processes since ChatGPT launched is I expected that some would race ahead or some would be a bit afraid or bound up by the regulatory implications of what they were doing. So there would be different tracks of how people adopted AI. And I expected that people would not really gravitate to the productivity benefits the way that they did. I thought more of them would try and use AI for more creative ways of doing something or doing something they weren't already doing. And a lot of organizations are just gravitating to the productivity efficiency aspects of it. Do you have a sense that there's a certain point in time when the creative aspects are going to get unlocked? Is it we just need to get more familiar and more comfortable and then we turn to the creativity? Or do we need a different type of AI that just makes it obvious that you're supposed to use this for creative purposes?
That's a very interesting question. I'm not sure I completely agree with the thesis behind it.
You can disagree. I want to be disagreed with.
I'll tell you why. Because the sense I have is that a lot of those productivity aspects are actually related to creativity. So it could be around writing an essay. It could be around maybe creating like a blog post that can help you out. And it is true that people have engaged in that because that's the aspect of creativity that connects with economic value in a more direct, visceral way for a lot of people.
Yeah.
So it compels them in that direction. But I think it certainly is the case that there's probably a lot more poetry being written in the world. Now, I can't vouch for the quality of it, but there's probably more limericks in the world and more poetry in the world. And pick your favorite genre, haikus and koans that exist. Than existed before, and I think it's safe to predict that we'll see some sort of like an exponentiation.
Yep.
Now, this kind of stuff has been happening for a while, right? So if you look at filters that people apply to their pictures and so on and so forth, so it's going to continue to unfold. Again, I buy the idea absolutely that there's going to be more things that happen here than vanilla LLMs. Yep. There already are, right? So we're thinking about multimodality,
yep.
bringing an image and things of that nature. Yep. Certainly, we ourselves do things like voice synthesis, speech synthesis from the written text, which is not LLM-based. It's a different set of techniques that applies to it. But what I will say is that what LLMs have done is they've accelerated this journey.
Yep.
Because it's been some time since we saw such a profound shift in capability than we had before. So we can't take that away from it. So I think generative will always have that place in the sense that it was the first thing that kind of shifted us in a stepwise way towards AGI.
Yep. And then Niels has a question here, which I think relates to that. So the question is, do you think once we have AGI, there will be an intelligence explosion? And I suppose that connects back to the abundance point, where if we went like this with LLMs, are we going to keep going like that on the way to AGI?
Yeah, I think Niels, there already is an intelligence explosion that is already underway. The fact that if you have a thought, you have a question, you could be sitting around the dinner table arguing with someone about something, and you could literally turn to like Alexa or search or like many other techniques, but basically say, hey, what is the capital of Estonia? Someone says it's Helsinki, it's not, and you can have an argument and get that resolved. I would argue that already brings intelligence into our world.
Yep.
Now, will there be an explode? Will that accelerate and just get bigger and bigger? Absolutely, and it's going to be a great thing for the world, in my opinion.
Yep.
As long as we do it with responsibility, it's going to unlock amazing things.
Now, thinking about how people here in the room sort of might want to take your advice and apply it inside their own company, for example, there's a lot of startups here, and at the very least, a lot of founders, if they're not trying to build AI, they know they need to make use of AI. So what advice do you have for those people who are looking at their AI options? And what are the underserved areas of opportunity where you're like, if someone does that, they can come into Amazon world?
It's a good question. I've been an entrepreneur myself, so I've been in those shoes before. So look, I mean, it's hard to be formulaic about these things. And what I will say is that if there's some people in here who are PhDs in machine learning and a joint PhD in mathematics, and you've decided that transformers are not it, you're going to invent the next fundamental thing which is going to unseat transformers, have at it. Bring it on. Like, we would love to see that. In terms of general thoughts around incorporating AI especially into like a startup effort, what I'd say is, I'd start with this. I'd say AI is not perfect. Recognize that. Don't build your company on the assumption that it's going to be perfect. So what are some imperfections that exist today? Imperfections like latency in generating answers, right? That happens. Images that you generate might not be perfect. They might be off. That kangaroo with the extra arm, for example, depending on how you want to do it.
Poor Kate Middleton, that wasn't even an extra arm. It's like a quarter of an inch of a zipper, and she's being eaten alive.
Yeah. I'm sure with the right prompt you could get an extra arm. So assume that's going to happen. And so what does that mean? That means whatever product you're working on, whatever offering you're working on needs to be resilient to that. It needs to provide room for that. That's the first thing I said. The second thing I'd say is, you should bet on AI. You should not bet against it. So in other words, realize that AI is continuing to evolve, become more capable. It's happening very, very quickly. You should probably have a roadmap and a notion of your company that adapts to that and evolves with it. So bakes in it's kind of the counterpoint to the previous point I was making around imperfection. Assume that it's going to become more and more capable.
Yeah.
And so what would get unlocked in your company when that happens, having a notion of that could be very helpful. Or even like if you have a set of things, if we had this, this is what we would do with it, kind of puts you in a position where you're ready to take advantage when that time comes. The third thing I'd say is maybe much more of like an eternal point for all businesses and for all people, is to know your customer. You need to know your customer extremely well. And what I'd say there is that you can kind of get to know your customer at two levels. There's a notion of what the customer does today, the workflows they engage in, the kind of tasks that they have to do, and how they accomplish them today using technology that exists today. I would call that the conventional wisdom understanding of that customer. If you know something deeper around what would benefit them, what can advantage them, what can help them lead better lives, and you can unlock that with AI, that's super powerful, super powerful. So at Amazon, we have this technique we use, which is called working backwards. And it's quite instructive, actually, which is before you get a project started or you begin to build a product, what you do is you write the press release. Like the first thing you do is you write the press release. Okay. And that press release obviously is not going to contain details about the technology and how amazing it is. It's probably, unless you're someone that's serving engineers, obviously. It's not going to contain details of like every last feature function that your product has. It's going to be like a customer quote that you try and put in there. And it's going to be how you want the world to perceive it, what you have built. And then having written that, now build a product and now implement the technology that's worthy of it.
Yep. And
this sounds like a super simple thing. It's actually really hard. And it's really, really hard often for people like myself that come from a technical bent of mind to sort of do it, and very instructive and educational when you do it that way. So that's the thing. The fourth thing I would say is AI is expensive. We should acknowledge that. So you have to be mindful of that, because if you're a startup, you have a finite pool of resources. You want to preserve them, and you want to until you sort of realize some value here. And so being cognizant of that, you don't necessarily need to run the biggest model. You don't need to do all those things. And when you're ready to build it on Amazon.
And then I guess one follow-up to that is, I have personally experienced frustration trying to get chatbots to give more useful answers, and I'm not even trying to run a business or integrate it into huge workflows. What advice do you have for people who hit those frustrations? Obviously you're not going to tell them to give up, but how do you sort of get through the frustration layer and keep persisting? And what are the benefits of continuing to persist in your mind?
Yeah, what I'd say is that this is such a fundamental transformation, and we are probably different ways to talk about this. You could argue that we are on a new S-curve in technology. So for those of you that are familiar with the whole innovator's dilemma, framework of understanding things, and it's the case with when you move on to a different S-curve in technology, and the idea there is initially the technology, you've got like an S-curve where a technology came into existence, and for a while it was a certain state, and then it rapidly improves and becomes very, very good at addressing things, and then it ends a plateau, and diminishing returns begin to set in. Often when you move to a new technology, there's a different S-curve that's higher, and you've got benefit and value on this dimension. It's higher than the previous S-curve, but the lower level of the second S-curve is below. And so what happens is you actually have less capability in some ways, but different types of capabilities.
Yep.
And mastering that is important.
It's like when I swapped to be an AI journalist. That was definitely what happened to me. But go on.
There you go. I've experienced that myself many times in life, right? And so, for instance, when the internet first began to become big, there's some things you could do, off the web, which you were not capable of doing, and obviously that accelerated. So, persist is what I would say. This curve is going to go up a lot. It's almost inevitable. And learn from it, adapt to new tools would be my secular advice. So like everybody, including engineers like myself, right? Which is you want to bring in things like Code Whisperer into your life to make you more efficient. And you could be legendary as a software engineer. I guarantee you'll benefit from it.
There we go. Keep persisting, everyone. You've been a great audience. Thank you, Vishal.
Thank you.
And enjoy the rest of South by.
Thank you.